Hello friends, Crystal Bergfield here. Welcome back to school. This week we begin our journey into the tax system here in the United States. I'm really excited to share this video with you today. Let's get into it. I've got a few friends who became new patrons in the last month. So a shout out to Dawn Bauer, thank you woman. Jessica Pickle, thank you. Amy Helm, thank you. Dijamir Elmira, thank you very much. Thank all of you for becoming patrons and for supporting me. Make sure that you're sharing the Patreon information with your friends. The more people who learn, the better off we are. Let's dive into taxes today. We have a super complex and interesting history. Did you know that Spain, France, New Netherlands, and Great Britain all had stake in the United States before we were the United States? That's right. They all set out in ships and came and landed on this continent to explore, expand, and conquer. All of these countries decided to come over here and they started setting up colonies. And in fact, our first colony was Jamestown, Massachusetts, and it was set up in 1607. Over 150 years passed before we gained our independence. And slavery began on our continent in 1619. So, while it wasn't us as Americans having slaves, we were also complicit in it, and we didn't get rid of slavery after we gained our independence. Fast forward to the 1760s, and the British government was acting a fool. They were trying to get the colonies here in the United States. Remember this, it's still America. I should just call it America, huh? The colonies here in America to pay off a war that they had invested in. Great Britain overseas trying to say, we want you all here in America to pay for our war. Well, as you could imagine, that didn't go over quite so well. They were trying to raise taxes in the colonies, and our forefathers were feeling gypped, much like we feel today. Anybody? In the attempts by the British to raise revenue by taxing our colonies, notably the Stamp Act of 1765, which put a tax on every paper product that was being used by colonists, as well as Townshend tariffs, which taxed paint, glass, paper, and more. That was 1767. And then the Tea Act, taxing tea, and we know it as the Tea Party, that happened in 1763. Basically, the British government was trying to get money from the colonists a continent away to pay for their expensive private wars. What? Getting a little eerie much? Paying for private wars with tax money? Just saying. So that is when we decided that enough was enough. They gathered together and protested their lack of representation in Parliament and demanded that they had the same representation as British citizens. And this is where the term no taxation without representation comes from. Because what was happening is that colonists here in America were paying taxes to the British government back in Great Britain, but they weren't receiving any of the benefits, any of the coverage or security that paying taxes is supposed to cover. And so they started saying no taxation without representation. That's where that came from. The British government was trying to get one over. They were thinking that nobody would notice, the colonists wouldn't notice. But we were wise back then, we figured it out. And so even with super slow communication, ships sending messages, they knew what was up. Colonial resistance came to a head in 1770 when British soldiers opened fire on a mob of colonists, killing 5 men, count them, 5 men, and we call it the Boston Massacre. It was the death of these 5 men that eventually led to a revolution, the American Revolution. When I reflect on history, and that's the beauty of history, we get to reflect on it. We can memorize things, and that's what we're taught to do in school, but that's not where the value is. The value is when we reflect on history. 5 men that it took to get the people riled up and recognize that something was wrong and that they needed to act together in order to change things. Today we have hundreds of children and adults being killed at the hands of our government, and nobody's saying anything. And so what that leads me to think about is our evolution. In that community, only needing 5 people to die for them to realize that enough was enough, there was value there. And I would argue that while our community is very large, the American community is huge, we should still be able to see the value in one another. Yes, we've come up with great technologies, but what about evolution in the way that we see value? Maybe we've got some places to learn from history. So back at it, 1773 comes along and there's this tea tax that's happening where they're getting taxed for tea coming into the Americas, yet colonists are like, we don't need some tea. Why are you sending us this tea? And so in an act of rebellion, the Tea Party was them taking 342 chests of tea and dumping it into the bay. That was their act of rebellion. In response, Great Britain and Parliament applied an act called the Intolerable Acts, and it was designed to reassert imperial authority here in America. So the Imperial Acts pissed the colonists off even more. And I want to make a note that British soldiers were just that in that day. They weren't a part so much of the community, but they were there to do the job of containing the people and asserting that imperial authority on the people. All of this stuff is continuing to happen. Nobody's happy. Fast forward a few years, and colonists were like, fuck this shit, we're done. A group of colonial delegates, including George Washington, Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, and John Jay, met in Philly in September 1774 and gave voice to their grievances over British dominance, basically. The First Continental Congress did not go so far as to demand independence from Britain, but it denounced taxation without representation. It also exposed the problem that they had with maintaining British military over here for the British when all it was doing was keeping them suppressed. So they knew these things were happening, and so they began to organize around that. They also issued a declaration of the rights of all people, which then in a few years later went into our Declaration of Independence, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which we all know quite true. On April 19th, day before my birthday, shots were fired and the American Revolution broke out. When the Second Continental Congress convened, they brought more delegates in, including Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, and they voted to form the Continental Army, putting George Washington at the head of that army. And with that, it was on. We had an American Revolution. Now, the war began in 1774, but the war didn't end until September 3rd, 1783, when the British government finally recognized our independence. Woo! We gained independence, y'all. But as you can see, it was a long thing going. And what I love about our Declaration of Independence, these men set that declaration in 1776. And remember, they started it a couple of years earlier. They were fed up. So it took time for them to see that progress. Not until 1783 did they gain that full independence. And what I can envision is them signing this Declaration of Independence, showing it to George Washington to show to his men and be like, look, this is what you're fighting for, the freedom of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so having been a soldier myself, I can tell you, like, you need something, a vision, something to keep you motivated in the war, motivated in the battles, and to keep you locked in with your brothers and sisters in arms. So I can only imagine that the Declaration of Independence was that for them. It was their vision of what they wanted for the people that lived here in America at that time. Can you imagine having a battle cry stating that all men are created equal and that we all have the rights to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? I'd rock out to that. I'd go to war for that. The point is, the American Revolution started over taxes and 5 people being killed. But taxes, they were over it. That's how heavy and deep our taxation system is. But what about individual income tax. When did that come into play? Not until a little bit later, actually. We had the American Revolution, gained independence, and then in 1861, we came around, so this is, 100 years later, Abraham Lincoln shows up, and we have the Civil War coming up. And so that's when taxation of our income comes into play. Good old Abe was like, hey, we need to fund this war. And so they set up a tax to tax the people's income to pay for the war. Civil War goes by. That tax remained in effect for 10 years, and then they repealed that tax. It wasn't until 1894 that Congress tried to enable a flat federal income tax, although it was struck down by the Supreme Court, ruling it unconstitutional the following year because it didn't take into account the population of each state. But in 1909, Congress passed the 16th Amendment of our Constitution, which allowed the federal government to tax individual income regardless of state population. And Americans have been required to file and pay federal taxes ever since. Since 1950, our individual income tax have been used to support and pay for government expenses. 40% of the government's budget is used out of our personal income tax. Payroll taxes take up 35% of that budget, and only 9% of our corporate taxes are used to essentially fuel the government. We're in the system, started by a war over taxation without representation. And let's be clear, the colonists then, being ruled by the British government, were ruled by the same types of people that we are being ruled by today. This oligarchy of the rich, the wealthy. That's exactly what the British government was to them, these tyrannists, they called them. Today, our tyrannists happen to be billionaires and wealthy corporations. Although the difference is that then it took 5 colonists to be killed. Again, I'll keep saying this, for them to decide that something different needed to happen. For them to draw out their swords and take action against these injustices. Today, I'd say we are far past a need for a revolution, but not necessarily with sword or gun. We do legally have processes that we can take through our Congress and through the White House, through the executive branch. We can do it peacefully and with intention. Remember, that Declaration of Independence was their intention for why they were fighting for their rights. Do we need a new Declaration of Independence? Or do we need to just draw it up and have everybody read it again and remind them what our rights are? What our forefathers intended for our rights to be? What will it take for us to see our human value, our worth, and stand up against the lack of representation? I could say the suppression that we are held to through our taxes. And I'm not just talking about income taxes. Think on that for a moment. What are you worth? All right, friends, time for homework. Your homework for the week. I want you to set aside 5 or 10 minutes to ponder. Set a timer if you need to, but give yourself those full 5 or 10 minutes. And I want you to think about the history of our independence. What did that really mean? That they were able to see the lives of 5 colonists being killed and see how the taxation without representation was taking away from their humanity. We're in this space of division where many of us know that our rights are not being valued, that our rights are being taken, and we have many different advocacy groups set up to support those specific rights. But until the people, the American people, come together and realize that all of us collectively have this great power to create real change, to find representation again, until that happens, we'll continue to fight slowly, group by group, asking for our rights. So ponder on that. And then consider, what would it take for you to get over your beef with somebody else, to get over the pettiness or the feeling as if somebody else is taking what you need or have? What would it take for you to get beyond that? Or maybe it's just that you don't like somebody because they don't share the same religion. I want you to think about your part in this. What is your responsibility to be able to come together as community, even though things will never be perfect, never be exactly how you want them, and nobody's going to ever act exactly how you want them to act? Can you get over that? And can you realize that it takes us as a collective to come together and to fight together for our rights? That's your homework. So as a reminder, this whole month we'll spend on taxes. And we're going to spend the whole month really digging into what taxes are, what their purpose is, who has the power over these taxes. So join me as we continue this conversation. Make sure you do your taxes and get a little bit curious about these taxes and the representation that you currently have. All right, that's all for today. Thank you for your attention and your time. Continue to be curious, open your mind, open your heart, expand your reality, and let's grow.